Oh, don't mind me. Ouch. Seriously, don't mind me.
Walk, fashion, baby, work it, move that bit crazy.
Don't mind me in my, Chewbacca onesie. No, it's not a onesie, it's a robe. Ugh. Yes, I'm in my Chewbacca robe today. Just kidding, it's not mine. We're very much not on brand today, but I say we just roll with the punches. Today we are moving on with our 70s versus their early 2000s remakes. Now I'll be tackling Texas Chainsaw from 1974 to Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 2003. My general structure for today's video will be as follows. We'll discuss background information, historical significance, and any relevant other behind-the-scenes info. Then we'll break down the plots of either movies and discuss the similarities and differences. Up next will be a character comparison, so I'll probably talk about some side characters, our final girls, and of course Leatherface. After that, we'll compare the general styles of each of the films, the cinematography and the lighting and whatnot. And lastly, we'll compare the themes of either of the movies. What were they trying to say? Or not say. Then we'll do one big comparison where I touch on all the major points, and we'll try to decide which is the superior film. Oh. Most of the information that I got today came from a documentary that I found on YouTube. It's called Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003, The Making of. Because in this documentary, they actually covered a lot of information about the original. The original came out in 1974, of course, directed by Tobe Hooper. It was also co-written by Tobe Hooper and a man named Kim Hinkle. With a budget of roughly $140,000, it went on to gross over $30 million in the box office. Contrary to some popular theories, the original idea came to Tobe Hooper when he was standing in line at a department store and he was very frustrated by the masses of people. Moving in the line, he then found himself standing next to some chainsaws and he thought, man, it would be super nice if I could just mow all these people down. It was also partially inspired by the real-life grave robbing / killer Ed Gein. The reason why this movie became so iconic is threefold. Number one, the way that it was marketed made it seem like it was based on true events. In the 70s and even in the 90s, it was a lot easier to get people to believe that kind of thing. Reason number two, because it was one of the first of its kind. The 70s was the birth of the slasher, and even in the same year in 1974, you had Black Christmas come out, as well as the movie Deranged, which is also based on the life of Ed Gein. And then Alice Sweet Alice came out in 1976, and then of course Halloween came out in 78, which kicked off the slasher craze of the 80s. So a lot of people credit Texas Chainsaw Massacre as one of the first true slashers. Although I would like to make an argument for a movie called Straight Jacket that came out in 1964. It was directed by William Castle, stars Joan Crawford, and it really does give me early slasher energy. Very fun movie, by the way, highly recommend. But Texas Chainsaw, obviously a much more overt slasher, was much more gruesome in concept, and it achieved this without even showing much blood. And the third and final reason I'll be discussing today as to why this movie became so iconic is because it's just a great fucking movie. It innovated in so many ways. I mean, for one, the score was not even real music, it was just a bunch of really weird sounds. It had groundbreaking cinematography that would inspire hundreds, if not thousands, of more horror movies at this point, and the horrendous working conditions cultivated an environment that was so toxic that it translated onto the screen, and it can never be recreated, unless it's 2003 and you're Michael Bay. Now on to the remake. It came out in 2003. It was directed by a man named Marcus Nespiel. He is actually a German director, and he was sought out by producer Michael Bay. It had a budget of about $9.5 million and went on to gross about $107.4 million. Living up to the original was obviously not going to be easy, so luckily they had a team of very competent people to take on the project. For example, with Michael Bay, he had previously worked on a lot of no-budget music videos. I believe that's kind of like where he got his start in his career, and he called that guerrilla filmmaking. So he had experience doing a lot with a little, which was perfect for a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. Real quick, I forgot to mention that me and all the homies actually hate Michael Bay, and if you're curious about this article will be linked down below. All the actors in the behind the scenes said that they really enjoyed working with Nespiel, and they all had pretty much just positive things to say, despite the fact that a few of them did mention that sometimes it meant they just wouldn't eat all day, but it's because he always got the job done. But basically, the cast of this movie all had a really great time, apparently except for Jessica Biel.
Everyone's kind of annoying. I just like to do my stuff and go back to my trailer.
Okay, girl, go off. I reviewed this movie about a year ago, I think, and in that review I did mention that the actress who played Pepper, Erica Learson, screamed so loud in her audition that the people in that office building thought that it was real. Well, I found some footage from that audition, and it's, It's a lot. And apparently she screamed a lot while on set because there were huge banana spiders everywhere, and honestly, girl, same. They also got the original cinematographer from the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie to work on the remake because he was friends with the director. So that might be one of the biggest contributing factors to this film's success at the time. And this movie is still considered by many to be one of the best remakes of a classic movie. And it also began the early 2000s remake craze. There's a remake craze every 20 to 30 years because horror reflects the fears of society at any given time. Horror can be extremely versatile, and I think it's the best genre for remakes. For example, in the 50s, they started to remake a bunch of horror movies from the 30s. And then in the 80s, they remade a bunch of movies from the 50s. And then in the 2000s, they remade a bunch of movies from the 70s and 80s. Give us another 5 to 10 years and we're gonna be seeing remakes of Jennifer's Body, The Devil's Rejects, Valentine. I mean, we got a remake of The Invisible Man last year, and almost every major movie that's coming out now is part of a huge franchise, so maybe we're already there. So you could say that both the original and the remake were trailblazers of their time. The original kind of kicked off the beginning of the slasher craze, and then the remake began the 2000s remake era. In terms of behind the scenes information, I don't want to go in too deep with it right now because so much of it actually pertains to the other topics of this video. And also, I've already gone pretty in depth with both of these movies before when I did my TCM series, so you might be wondering why I'm not diving into all the information about why the original movie was so painful to make. But it's because in my original review, I already covered all of that information, you know, how terrible it was to film the dinner scene, why that scene became so iconic. So I already covered that like a year ago. Go watch that video though if you want to hear all that information. I'm also not covering it again because I feel like for horror fans, it is kind of common knowledge at this point. So today I'm going to be focusing a lot more heavily on the remake. And like I mentioned, I hadn't seen this behind the scenes documentary before for the remake, so that's where most of my information is coming from. And before I dive into the plot, I just want to point out something super cute about this documentary because it opened in the way that the movies do with the text scrolling on the screen. I found that to be very charming. But onward with the plots. In the original, Sally, Franklin, and their 3 friends run out of gas while driving to their grandfather's house. One by one, they are tormented and killed by a chainsaw-wielding killer and his psychopathic family. In the remake, a few friends are horrified when a hitchhiker shoots herself in their car. Looking for help in a tiny town off the road, they find themselves being targeted by a family of cannibals and a chainsaw-wielding lunatic. So let's discuss similarities, differences. Both movies begin with a group of friends on their way through Texas. In the original, they're on their way to their grandfather's house because it's been left to them in his will. In the remake, they have taken a cannabis-fueled trip to Mexico and now they're on their way home. As always, some of the plot differences will come into play when we're talking about our characters, but there are some things I do want to point out. In the original, you have the infamous dinner scene, probably the most iconic part of this movie, the most horrendous scene to ever film in history, probably, unless we're talking snuff films, which we do not do on this channel, by the way. But the dinner scene is noticeably missing from the remake, which I am actually a fan of. In the 3 sequels that came after the original before this remake, they all tried to recapture the dinner scene, and it couldn't really be done. Weirdly enough, I think that they came the closest to it in Texas Chainsaw: The Next Generation, which is hand to God one of the worst movies I've ever seen, and I love it. They didn't include the dinner table scene in the remake at all because they were smart about how they constructed their remake, but we'll get into that in a bit. That would have been way too predictable and old, so they ended the remake in a slaughterhouse, which I found to be really interesting and very on brand. And there are similar moments with our final girl driving away, but instead of being covered in blood in the back of a truck, Erin herself is driving the car. So lots of nice little homages in the movie while still remaining funky fresh. Although overall with the plot, I do find it to be a little bit less coherent in the remake. Not that the original is super coherent by any means, but there are a lot of added elements to the remake that I just question a little bit, and it makes the movie feel more like just a bunch of random events happening than like a coherent storyline. But I think I'll get more into that later. Let's move on to our characters. The most noteworthy side protagonist in the original is Franklin, but that is quite honestly because he annoys me. Listen, I understand his frustrations with his unempathetic travel companions, but he did not have to do all of that. The most noteworthy antagonist side character would have to be the hitchhiker, obviously. His name isn't said in the movie, I don't think, but he is called Nubbins. I feel like he kind of gets overshadowed because Leatherface became the iconic image of this franchise, but Nubbins scared me more. Talk about a performance. Acting, learn about it. Some underrated dialogue that I wish people would discuss more is the fact that when he gets into the van, he talks about how no part of the cow goes to waste.
They take the head, boil it, except for the tongue. For the nose and the gums and all the flesh, and they boil it down into a big jelly of fat. It's really good.
He's talking about melting down everything on a cow's head except for the tongue, and that's how we get gelatin, baby. This holds up phenomenally well because for some reason people still feed cups of Jell-O to their children and frat guys still serve Jell-O shots at their parties, as if y'all aren't eating down melted cow bones. Or pig bones, I'm sure Jell-O doesn't discriminate. The dialogue is overtly uncomfortable because it's gross, but there's also the subliminal horror that we have all probably eaten Jell-O at some point in our lives and now we have to think about what we've consumed. And this is a reach, but walk with me. To attempt to understand this family's logic, they aren't wasteful, right? So what's the difference between melting down a cow head and taking advantage of the fresh meat that shows up at your doorstep? Waste not, right? Okay, we're getting too themey. I need to walk back now. In conclusion, the hitchhiker deserves more credit. I think that Nubbins is the unsung anti-hero of this movie. Not of the story itself, but just for the horror genre in general, you know what I mean? I'm gonna talk about the hitchhiker from the remake, but I really need to grab a light because this lighting, she's not doing it for me. Hopefully that's a little bit better. I have a tiny little ring light next to me now. In the remake, they switch things up on us a bit, and the hitchhiker is a woman. What? Not only do they do a gender swap, but now this hitchhiker is also a victim. She's not a member of the family. This is my favorite thing that a remake does, where you can tell exactly where the inspiration came from, but it's changed completely.
If I look at the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, those movies have been done. You can't do them in the same way again. You know, audiences think they know what will happen, and then you surprise them by not doing that. I think that is the only reason to make a remake.
Well said, director Marcus Nespiel. I agree. I also hope that I'm saying your name correctly. So that was one of my favorite parts of the movie, except for what she ends up doing. Big old trigger warning, wow. But hopefully you've seen the movie because there will be spoilers out the ass today for both of these movies. Anyway, moving on now to our final girls. I feel like Sally from the original is kind of an underrated final girl. It's all about Laurie Strode and Sidney Prescott and Nancy Thompson. I want to throw a little more love out there for Miss Sally. She's a completely normal girl, you know, no weird quirks. She's kind of a blank slate in terms of her personality, which allows any of us to pretty easily imagine ourselves in her shoes. And the reason why I think she deserves more credit is because she fought her way out of that hell, busting through windows and all. And Erin is a new and worthy reimagining, I would say. She's very crafty, jump-starting cars, cleaving off Leatherface's arm. She definitely has a little bit more oomph to her, I will give you that. She is also somewhat of an underrated final girl, although I don't think I would necessarily put her on like a top 10 list or anything. She also wears the classic early 2000s final girl fit. If she's wearing this fit, then you know she's the final girl. I honestly don't have too much to say about her. I mean, she was crafty and she was worth rooting for. Except that she threw about half a joint out the window. Now that is an unforgivable sin. Now, of course, we must discuss Leatherface. In the original, he was played by Gunnar Hansen and obviously became the historical standout icon. And then in the remake, he is played by Andrew Brianarski. While I was doing my research, I finally saw his face for the first time and I was like, I'd know that face anywhere. It's the Cavern Henchman from the live-action adaptation of Scooby-Doo. That's where you guys all know him from too, right? Anyway, in the original, Leatherface is much more of a cog in the machine. He's part of the family. He does these things because it's what the family does. It's how he was raised. He doesn't know any better. In the remake, Leatherface knows what he's doing and he enjoys what he's doing. The pain that he inflicts is more for enjoyment and nobody really has to tell him to do it. Also, let's talk about his look. I think that both of these looks are perfectly suited for either movie that they were in. In the original, I don't know what it's giving. It's giving skin-wearing maniac cosplaying as a retired teacher. In the remake, it's giving evil butcher who's wearing your face and he likes it. In the remake, it makes sense why he enjoys inflicting pain because it's said that he was bullied for his skin condition when he was younger. Typically, people who are picked on then like to inflict pain on other people so they feel like they have some sense of power. At all the sad little men in my comments that try to insult me. Feel better, love. Speaking of power, the way that these men worked their chainsaws was both great, but I think in the remake he brought it just a little bit harder. Brianarski said that he practiced a lot with the chainsaw because he feels that the relationship between Leatherface and the chainsaw is that of best friends. This was no easy task though, because the chainsaw he was working with was 35 pounds. Sometimes they would put a bike chain on the saw, which was a little bit more safe, but at other times when they actually had to cut something, they would be using a real chainsaw. And he was super into it. Like frighteningly into it.
He's a little terrifying. I'm not quite sure about him. There was one scene where he's supposed to be cutting my shirt off my back, and he's like grunting and moaning, jabbing me and stabbing me in the back, and I'm like hunched over dead and going, Andrew, you're cutting me, you're cutting me. And he was literally like cutting into my back and stuff and didn't care. But he's gonna snap.
So there's that. I guess they got the right guy to be playing Leatherface, but I would not be having any of that. As soon as that man so much as gave me a light scrape on my back, I'd be like, you're done. You're done. I'll talk about who was my favorite Leatherface though when we get to our overall comparison. So for now, let's discuss the style of both of these movies. The cinematography of the first movie is so iconic that you can literally just put up a picture of a girl in red shorts walking up to a house and people will know what you're referencing. So much about that movie had you feeling the utter claustrophobia of the situation. Speaking of the aforementioned shot, this welcomed us to what would be that extremely oppressive force of the house, which is why it shows up like this the first time that we see it. There's also so much visual food in the original without it being crass. I mean, like I mentioned, you don't really see any blood in this movie. For example, you also have the shot in the very beginning of the movie where they're driving past this cattle ranch with hundreds of cows all just existing in wait to be slaughtered, which is a fun little wink to the audience that's like, hey, all these characters are about to be slaughtered too. It was also obviously very gritty, had that 70s vibe to it with the film, and much of what happens is implied. You're left to conjure up a lot in your imagination. For example, a girl gets thrown onto a hook and we never see it from behind, but oh mama, do you feel it? And we've already talked about the horrible filming conditions that created an atmosphere unlike any other movie. And overall, it's hard to fully describe the style of this film. It has this one-of-a-kind quality to it that has allowed it to earn its classic status. So we're getting on to the style of the remake now. This was a tall order to fill. But as we know, Daniel Pearl, the original cinematographer, returned to be the cinematographer, so the shooting style was quite similar, but the lighting is a bit more unique, and that actually might be thanks to the director Marcus Nispel. So Marcus was actually a painter, and he was inspired by Rembrandt, and he said that horror was one of the only genres to utilize that kind of style. So that's where a lot of his inspiration for the lighting of this movie came from. It almost gives this kind of Scooby-Doo, shadowy, haunted house vibe, and I'm a big fan. And for my last subtopic within the topic of the cinematography, I want to talk about the infamous shot where they go from the dashboard through her head though, because it's like everyone's favorite shot, including mine. They actually used an endoscopic camera, which is about the size of a quarter, they said. Those cameras are typically used to go up inside of people's bodies. Speaking of, if you are a cis man age 50 or older, you better be getting in there for your prostate exam. Prostate cancer is so common and yet so avoidable and treatable if you catch it early, so please take care of your little booty holes. Anyways, then they had a dummy recreation of the woman that the camera would go through, and the shot of her mouth smoking afterwards was achieved by her taking a drag from her cigarette and then lying still. So that's cool. It was a lot more complicated to get that shot than I initially realized. They also had to like cut open the top of the van for the big crane with the camera to go through. It was a whole big thing. But bravo, it was worth it. Everybody still talks about that shot to this day. Look at me. But now we're gonna move on and talk about the style in terms of the production design, which is one of my favorite things because that is my job, baby. If you're new here, I do production design for a very small production company, so it's one of my favorite aspects of film. The house that they shot in the remake was actually very decrepit and run down in real life. It was super moldy, so they had to do the whole thing where people come in with hazmat suits to kill all the mold, but then they decided to leave it there and seal it into the walls because they still wanted it to have its moldy appearance. And you know how when they try to go to the toilet, or just in general being in the wheelchair man's house or in Leatherface's lair, there's a super gritty and disgusting atmosphere? Fun story, that's actually the exact aesthetic of this really bizarre recurring nightmare nightmare that I've been having for about a year and a half now. I actually talked about this in my vlog channel a long time ago, I think when I was doing a Get Ready With Me. I've had some form of this dream about 6 times now where I'm in an utterly filthy public bathroom where the walls are very low and you can just see a bunch of people doing their business. I could never really explain the level of filth that I would see and the level of disgust that I felt, but now I actually have a visual reference. It's the aesthetic of this movie. So that feels good. Now a bit of a weight has been lifted now that you can see the inner machinations of my brain a bit more clearly. Also, I watched this movie for the first time about a year ago. So was this the origin of my terrors? No, I think it started happening earlier, like when COVID actually came over to the United States, but I don't think there's any correlation there. That was what we in show business like to call sarcasm. Anyway, overall with the style, I am not sure if it's the color grade that they shot in or if it's some sort of filter that they put over the movie, but I feel like they achieved a very similar effect to the original. It has a very similar gritty feel, if not grosser, as I've mentioned, and I think that that's one of the main reasons actually why people consider it to be a worthy remake. And finally, for the last topic of the day, we're going to talk about the different themes of these movies. A film critic in the documentary mentioned something to the effect of, the thought used to be that everything in small towns was pure. I think what he meant to say is that they preserved the true American culture, which is a whole other thing because what is American culture if not just theft and murder? Which brings us to what I think is a very accidentally profound message in these movies. The most American people are actually the fucking worst. But because of all of this individualistic propaganda that we're subjugated to, they live under the guise that they are actually the purest form of human life. And I think this topic, this theme is applicable to both movies, but there are some differences as well. We spoke about this already with Leatherface's motivations, but those do play into the themes of either movie. In the original, it's touching on family influence and tradition. Just because something has been done a certain way for a very long time does not mean that it's a good thing. That's why old people sound so goofy when they talk about their traditional values. I think this is best exemplified by Leatherface operating by the whims of his family and not of his own volition. But being born and raised in that environment, he doesn't know any better, and it's kind of sad. In the remake, it's a bit unclear if this is tradition. I mean, the cannibalism thing and the fact that all these people in this town are probably inbred, that's probably more of a tradition thing. But for most of the movie, you really just see Leatherface operating at his own free will and everyone is just kind of at his mercy. You have this guy in a wheelchair and it's not explained, but you can assume that he's missing his legs because Leatherface got angry with him one day. And as we spoke about, Leatherface was heavily bullied when he was younger for his skin condition, which is why he likes to cover his face with other people's skin and why he's so violent. TCM 2003 was an anti-bullying PSA before it was cool. It could also be making commentary on the fact that a lack of empathy in the world can lead to extremism. Is that a stretch? Maybe. As Harry Styles would say, because you never know when they might come and chainsaw your legs off, baby. All right, my dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for sticking with me until the final comparison of this video. I'm gonna take a new angle with the way that I do an overall comparison because a new topic that I want to cover is how do I feel about these movies upon a rewatch? Because with either of these movies, I feel completely the opposite. With the original, I feel like there are so many rich details to pick up on every single time. And as I spoke about at length with the hitchhiker's dialogue in the movie, that was something that I had never picked up on before despite having seen this movie. I believe this was my 4th or 5th time. And I think wherever I'm at in life, the original will hit me in a different way. And to be really transparent, before I had much knowledge on the 70s and slashers, like when I was first exploring this genre, I wasn't in love with the original because, you know, I wasn't really used to kind of the pacing of 70s movies. It was a bit different. I hadn't explored slashers at all. And now I adore the movie. I love it. It's so thoroughly entertaining. Like, it's fantastic. Whereas with the remake, I loved that movie the first time that I saw it. I was like, wow, it's beautiful. It's fresh. It's shocking. It's not too similar to the original. Like, they switched things up in very effective ways. And then on a rewatch, I was like, this is not as good as I remember it. There are still certainly a lot of details to pick up on, but it's mainly with all the touches they threw in with the production design, which kudos, by the way. Remember how the production design is the literal aesthetic of my recurring nightmare? So again, bravo. But the plot plot is a little bit like non-existent. The hitchhiker opening scene is a great opening. It allows them to get from point A to point B and carry out the rest of the events of the story. But there were a lot of very random characters who are of almost zero consequence, and a lot of the plot feels extremely disjointed to me. Like that whole side moment when Aaron ends up in that trailer and these women had stolen that baby. What was up with that? I realized upon a second viewing that the remake actually mostly just consists of shock value, which is just not my favorite. I just prefer a more plot-heavy movie. I was really surprised by how I honestly didn't like it that much upon a second viewing, because the first time I watched it, I probably would have given it like 4 out of 5 stars. This time I only gave it 2.5 stars. I just was not feeling it. In terms of the plot, I definitely lean towards the original because it's more of a traditional 3-act structure. It's more coherent to me. And it's just a simple slasher. It's not that dense, but the progression of events still feel very natural. Whereas some of the events of the remake, like the women in the trailer, as I mentioned, or the sheriff, it just feels very forced. In terms of the characters, I do think that they are more memorable in the remake, but I don't know if I really have a preference. Especially with our final girl, I don't know who I'm more into. Sally holds a special place in my heart. I think she's underrated, but then you have Erin, who's a bit more crafty and a bit more spunky. So I think that the final girl might be a tie for me. Ooh, this does not usually happen. And then with Leatherface, the boys, I think that they each delivered what they were meant to for their respective movies. So again, it's hard to choose. But it's sort of like with James Jude Courtney, how I've mentioned that I feel like, you know, Nick Castle, he is the Michael Myers, the original, but Courtney has just realized his full potential. Brianarski was just much stronger with his movements. He was much more at one with his chainsaw. I think all the practice really paid off. But I have to say, I think I prefer the character of Leatherface in the original just because it made more sense to me. So in terms of the performances, I would say I prefer Brianarski, but I prefer more the concept of Leatherface in the original. When you consider the setting he's in, I just prefer the idea that his family is forcing him into these things. That he was just one part of a whole psychopath. I think that gives Leatherface a bit more complexity, and I'm a little bit more interested in what makes him tick. Even though not knowing is what makes it so good. I'm just not really a fan of the, oh, he got bullied, so obviously he became a monster. It's just kind of a basic and slightly weak origin story. But stylistically, both of the movies are pretty even for me. They're the same, but different in a good way. And finally, thematically, I think you know what's up because I prefer Leatherface's motivations in the original. And given my complete lack of enjoyment rewatching the remake, I think our obvious winner today is the original. Yes, oh yes. I really don't want to disparage the remake though, because it is a great movie, at least upon your first viewing. The people who worked on it respected the original and they made great choices. It's just not really my kind of movie. They took the things that were great about the remake and either like flipped them on their head, or they took the story in a completely new direction, but that still made sense and was still on brand to the original, all while remaining true to the vibes of the movie they were creating. So I really respect the remake, don't get me wrong, I think it's just not a movie for me. I'll still rewatch it though. I feel like it's a better one to maybe watch with a party, with a group of friends, but the original definitely has a special place in my heart. I really enjoy that movie and I still don't own it. Why? Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you liked the video, I hope that you like the video, wink wink. It really does help my channel and it just lets me know if you guys enjoy these kinds of videos, if you want to see more of them. I think I'm gonna put up a poll in my community tab if you guys do want to see the Carrie remake comparison. So check that out, let me know, and if you want to see that, make sure that you're subscribed and click the notification bell so you don't miss it. Big thank you to my patrons, as always. I love you. Mwah, 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 mwah. And in terms of other new content, I did just release my first ever horror video game video. I tried my hand at playing Outlast and it was really fun. I got really positive responses on that video, just a lot of very kind comments. So thank you for allowing me the space to try new things. I appreciate you all very dearly. But other than that, stay hydrated, get your prostate checked, and bye!